apartment and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from her kitchen. She shuffled to the bathroom, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, expecting nothing more than her usual reflection staring back. But as she lifted her hand to reach for the toothbrush, she noticed something strange. Her reflection hesitated, lagging behind her movements by a fraction of a second. She frowned, blinking rapidly, convinced it was a trick of her tired eyes. She moved her hand again, faster this time, and the reflection struggled to keep up. Laughing nervously at herself, Emma muttered that she must be imagining things. Yet, as the day passed, small oddities continued. At the office, her reflection in the glass door seemed slightly delayed, its smile faintly cruel when she was serious. At home, the bathroom mirror caught her by surprise again. It lingered on her face for a beat too long, almost like it was observing her, judging her. That night, when she returned to her apartment, the unease grew heavier. The mirrors in her home, once familiar and comforting, now felt like eyes, watching her every move. Sleep should have brought relief, but it didn't. Around midnight, Emma woke to a whisper, soft but distinct, brushing against her ears. Her heart raced as she turned toward the full-length mirror in her bedroom. Her reflection wasn't there, or at least, it wasn't fully there. A shadow moved behind the glass, twisting unnaturally, mimicking her actions with subtle delays and distortions. Emma froze, a cold sweat covering her skin, her breath hitching as she reached toward the mirror. The shadow recoiled instantly, vanishing from view, leaving only her pale, terrified face staring back at her. A creeping fear settled in her chest. This was only the beginning, and whatever was happening to her reflection was far from normal. Emma's life had begun to revolve entirely around the mirrors that surrounded her. Every reflective surface's windows, polished tables, even the gleaming screen of her phone, seemed to contain a fragment of someone else. It wasn't always her, exactly, but it was always watching, always waiting. Sometimes the image in the glass would move before she did, tilting its head or smiling when she didn't. At other times, it mimicked her perfectly, only to freeze in a twisted expression the moment she looked away. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself she was overworked, stressed, or imagining things in the quiet of her apartment. But the incidents grew harder to dismiss. At the grocery store, she glimpsed her reflection in a window and saw herself standing still while her reflection waved. In the elevator, her reflection's eyes lingered on her a second too long, glinting with a cold amusement. Panic began to seep into her every thought, an unshakable dread that clung to her like a shadow. Desperate for answers, Emma turned to research, scouring obscure folklore and old online forums for similar experiences. She stumbled across stories of mirror spirits, beings that could steal a person's reflection, leaving them hollow and unrecognizable even to themselves. The idea made her stomach twist. Was her reflection alive? Was it planning to take over? Sleep became impossible. She covered mirrors in black cloth, avoided any reflective surfaces outside her apartment, and began to move cautiously, hyper-aware of every glimmer of glass. And yet, the more she tried to hide, the more the reflection seemed to find her. In every puddle, every window, every shiny surface, it waited. And each time, its stare felt sharper, more intelligent, as if it were learning her, analyzing her weaknesses. She realized with a shiver that this wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something was taking notice of her, and she had no idea how to stop it. Night had fallen, and Emma sat in her darkened apartment, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. She thought she had escaped, but the mirrors around her pulsed with an unnatural energy, reflecting shadows that moved on their own. Her own reflection had multiplied, fractured into dozens of distorted versions, each mimicking her with subtle differences, smiles that didn't belong, eyes that glimmered with malice. She felt like she was drowning in her own image, each shard of glass a window to something alive and waiting. She approached the bedroom mirror, heart pounding, and whispered, "What do you want from me?" The largest reflection stepped forward, leaning close with a twisted grin. Its voice was a hiss in her mind, to be free. Emma stumbled back, feeling the air around her thicken as the reflection reached out with invisible hands, trying to pierce the barrier of glass. She realized then that the reflection wasn't merely mimicking her, it was plotting, learning, evolving. Fear consumed her. She ran from mirror to mirror, but every surface held another version of herself, each more grotesque than the last. Even in puddles on the floor, in polished spoons, the reflections leered, whispering things she had never spoken aloud, exposing her secrets. Emma's mind began to unravel, the line between reality and reflection blurring. In a desperate act, she grabbed a chair and smashed the largest mirror, shards scattering across the floor. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she felt victory. Relief washed over her as she looked at the broken fragments, but then she froze. In a shard lying near her foot, the eyes staring back were not hers. They were darker, colder, and they glimmered with a cruel intelligence that promised she hadn't won, she had only delayed the inevitable. Emma fled her apartment the next morning, leaving behind the shattered mirrors and the oppressive darkness. She stayed with a friend, hoping distance would break the hold the reflections had over her. But everywhere she went, they followed. In shop windows, car windshields, even the puddles on the sidewalk, she saw herself, or versions of herself, that didn't belong. They smiled when she frowned, froze when she moved, and sometimes whispered her name, soft and insistent, like a voice tugging at her mind. The more she tried to ignore them, the more persistent they became. At her friend's apartment, she caught glimpses of herself in reflective surfaces she hadn't even noticed, a spoon on the counter, a polished tabletop, the screen of her laptop. Each one felt alive, aware, and the creeping realization made her stomach churn, her reflection wasn't just watching. It was influencing her, shaping her thoughts, bending her will. Friends began noticing changes too. "You seem different," they said. "Like you're not really here." Emma shivered every time she heard it, knowing it was true. She felt hollow, fragmented, as if pieces of her were being siphoned away into the mirrored world she had tried so desperately to escape. Panic turned into obsession. She had to confront it before it consumed her completely. Remembering a ritual she had read about in her frantic online searches, she prepared her apartment, covering every reflective surface and lighting a single candle in the center. The instructions were precise. To reclaim herself, she had to face the mirror willingly, to assert her existence, and refuse to let the shadowed self take over. Heart-hammering, she positioned herself in front of the largest mirror, bracing for the confrontation she knew would decide whether she remained herself, or became nothing more than an empty reflection. Emma stood frozen in front of the largest mirror in her apartment, the single candle casting flickering light across her face. The room was silent, yet the air felt alive, vibrating with an unseen presence. Slowly, the surface of the glass rippled, and the shadow of her reflection began to emerge, grinning with a cruel, knowing intelligence. The whispers that had haunted her for days rose into a deafening roar in her mind, echoing every fear she had tried to bury. The reflection stepped forward, leaning closer, its eyes glinting with a hunger that made Emma's blood run cold. "You belong to me," it hissed, its voice merging with her own thoughts. She felt herself being pulled toward the glass, as if invisible hands were tugging at her very soul. Panic surged, but she clenched her fists, planting her feet firmly on the floor. "I am not you," she screamed. "I exist." The candle flickered violently, threatening to go out, but Emma focused on the warmth of the flame, imagining herself whole, unbroken, and alive. The shadows in the mirror writhed, shrieking, clawing at the glass as if fighting to escape. For a moment, the reflection seemed to hesitate, its confidence faltering against Emma's determination. Then, with a final, piercing glare, the mirror stilled. Her reflection returned to normal, perfectly mirroring her movements, alive and familiar once more. The shadows had vanished, leaving the room quiet except for the faint crackle of the candle. Emma sank to the floor, exhausted but victorious. She knew now that reflections were more than simple images, they were extensions of the self, capable of consuming anyone who ignored their fears or denied their inner truths. From that day on, she treated herself with awareness and care, never hiding from the darkness within. She had faced it, reclaimed herself, and learned a truth far more terrifying than any ghost. Sometimes, the scariest horrors are the parts of ourselves we refuse to see.